We understand the prop system in React. Let's take a look at another system that's a little bit similar, but designed for a very different purpose. Okay, so once again, we just took a look at the prop system. This is all about how we communicate data from a parent component down to a child. We're now going to take a look at another system called state. The state system is all about tracking a piece of data that's going to change over time inside of our application. And anytime that piece of data changes, we might want to somehow update the content on the screen of our device. These two systems, I can almost guarantee you're going to get confused at some point in time. So I'm going to tell you this once again, and I'm going to repeat it several times throughout the course. The prop system is all about communicating data from a parent to a child. State is all about tracking a single piece of data, and anytime it changes, we will want to somehow update what is on the screen of our device. Okay, let's take a look at a couple of examples of state and get a better idea of how it works. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is take a look at a couple sample applications. In each one of these little sample applications, we're going to try to identify some piece of data that might need to change over time. So the first application we're going to look at is a simple counter app. So maybe it's got some button right here that says increase, another one that says decrease. And whenever a user taps on increase, as you might guess, we're going to increase that count by 1. So maybe it goes all the way up to 7. And if they click on or tap on decrease, it'll decrease by 1. So maybe down to like -1 or -2 or whatever else. So in this little application, I want to ask a couple of different questions, 3 questions in total. My first question for you is, what piece of data inside this application is changing? Once you identify that piece of data, I then have a second question. What type of data is it? In other words, is it a number, a string, an object, an array? What kind of data is it? And then finally, what is that piece of data's starting value? Like when we first boot up our application, what is the starting value of that piece of data? So let's try to answer these 3 questions for this very simple app. Well, I think that the first question is pretty clear. I think that the piece of data that's changing inside of our application is like this counter variable right here. We've got some count, and we want to change it over time. And every time we change that piece of data, we probably want to update the content on the screen of our application. Next up, what type of data is it? Well, it is a counter, so I think it's safe to say that it's a plain number. And finally, what is the data's starting value? In other words, when our application first boots up, what is that counter going to say? Well, I think it's reasonable to say that the default starting value would be like simply 0. Okay, now this might seem like some weird 3 questions right here, but let's repeat this process with 2 other applications really quickly. Then we're going to start to write out our first example with state. Okay, so here's the next one. So in this application, we might show a label above a text input. And maybe anytime a user types in a name right here, so like my name is Steven, so I'll enter in Steven. Maybe character by character, I would then want to print out whatever text the user entered into that text input. So as I type in Steven, I would want to see your name is Steven up here right here. Once again, a very simple application, but I want to try to answer these 3 questions about it once again. So what piece of data is changing? What type of data is it? And what is the default starting value? Well, in this case, I think that the piece of data that's changing over time is some like name variable. Maybe we somehow read out some text that the user is entering into this input right here and store it in a variable called name or something similar. What type of data is it? Well, it's definitely probably going to be a string. It's a series of characters. It's a name. So I think that the piece of data that's changing over time is a string. And then finally, what's the default starting value? Well, when we first boot up our application, I would expect to see like nothing inside of here, nothing inside the text input, and nothing after your name is whatever. So I think the default starting value would be an empty string. That's supposed to be an empty string right there. It's really 2 separate quotes. Okay, let's repeat this process just one more time. So in this one right here, I've got a list of blog posts that I'm showing to a user. Let's repeat the same process once again. So what's the piece of data that's changing inside this application? Well, let's imagine for a second how we would really show a list of blog posts to a user inside of an app. Chances are our app does not have some like hard-coded list of blog posts. Instead, there's probably some API requests that we might need to make from our application to an outside server to fetch a list of API requests. So maybe we would have some piece of data called like blog posts that would be changing over time inside of our application. By default, when our application first starts up, that piece of data would maybe be an empty array, because when our application first starts, we have no blog posts whatsoever. At some point in time, we would then complete an API request to fetch our list of blog posts, and then we can update this piece of data right here, something called like blog posts. And that would maybe be an array of objects where each object describes like the title and the content of a single blog post. Okay, so I know these 3 questions might seem a little bit weird, and it might seem weird to repeat the same process 3 times, but now that we understand these kind of 3 questions that we want to ask about a single application, let's come back in the next video, and we're going to start to put together our first example of working with state inside of a component. In this video, we're going to start to write out our first example with state. We're going to try to build this very simple counter application right here. Now, I know counter applications are probably really boring to you, but remember, I'm trying to give you a couple of different quick examples here of state. This is going to be the first one. We're going to go over several other small applications that focus on state, and each one is going to be progressively more and more complex. So this is the first one. We're going to take a look at more complicated stuff very quickly. All right, so to get started, we're going to first create a new screen inside of our screens directory. So as usual, I'll create a new file inside the screens directory called counterscreen.js. And then inside of here, we'll put together our usual boilerplate. So we will import React from React. We will get view, text, and style sheet. Oh, and let's get button as well, because we probably need to show some buttons from React Native. We'll then create our counter screen. And inside there, we will return, for right now, a view. And that view will wrap a piece of text. And that text should say something like, I don't know, about current count. We'll just have this piece of text inside of here right now just to have something show up on the screen and know that our screen is working appropriately. After that, we could create our style sheet. We still will. We're not really using our style sheet right now. Nonetheless, it's kind of a good habit to create it inside of here because you never know when you're going to need to add in some styling. So I'll create it even though I don't really expect to use it right away. And I'll do an export default of counter screen at the bottom. All right, so there's our boilerplate. Now, as usual, we need to hook this up to our app navigator, or the stack navigator inside of our app.js file. Once we do that, we need to make sure that we also add a new button into our home screen. So a new button to show up along with the list of all the other buttons we already have. So let's take care of both those steps right now. I'll change back over to my app.js file. At the top, I'm going to import the screen I just created. So counter screen from source, screens, counter screen. I'll add in a new key value pair, so a new routing option inside this first object right here. So we'll do counter is counter screen. All right, so that's going to be it for our app.js file. So I'll save this one as well. And then finally, we can open up our home screen. Here's the home screen. I'm going to duplicate the button, one of the buttons anyways, and we'll just update the text. Go to counter demo. And then we'll update the navigate call right here. Rather than going to image, we'll go to counter instead. So that should be it. Let's save this one more time. All 3 of these files we've now changed should all be saved. And so if I flip back over to my application, I should be able to click on that link and see current count appear. Very good. And I should see the same thing on Android as well. Yep, looks good. Okay, so let's take a quick pause right here. When we come back to the next video, we're going to start to assemble our counter screen tiny little application.